Hey everyone, Matt here with Joanna and Dean again. Great to spend time together. Story time with Matt, is that okay? So, were you guys allowed to go out for Halloween? Like, I don't know if you grew up in Christian homes or anything. It can be a weird thing. If you're not kind of Christian upbringing, there's some groups of, like, I wasn't, my parents oscillated between some Halloweens I could go, and then they must have read something or heard someone say that Halloween was maybe bad or evil, and then the next year we couldn't, and we'd stay in the house with all the lights off, and if someone rang the doorbell, thinking we were just a spooky house, we'd pretend we weren't home. Like, it was such a crazy, awkward thing as a kid.
I remember being a kid and I wasn't allowed to dress as like scary things. There was one of my little friends, he was gonna be a devil. Okay. And I said, like, I'm not allowed to dress as a devil because the devil's real. And then we were like 4 years old, and we got in a big fight because he didn't think the devil was real.
Right.
I did.
Crazy, yeah.
Christian child.
So this passage that we're looking at today is a really tough one, really challenging one. And if we were to take it literally, we would have a lot of one-eyed, one-handed people, which is like, that's why Halloween pops up for me. It's this idea of like pirates, one-eyed pirates.
That's why you're talking about Halloween.
That's why this episode is called One-Eyed Pirates, because it's a
connection.
tough teaching around lust and the way we view people and the way we look at each other. And like, Jesus is not messing around on this one at all.
Yeah.
And so it's always timely, I think, whenever we talk about this stuff. And this one's really an important one. So let's jump into it. This is from, hopefully you've had a chance to read it together, Matthew 5:27 to 30. So what do you think?
Well,
Who's going to kick it off?
The first thing I think is, isn't it nice to know when we hear about stories like this in the church, or maybe we've gone through them, I don't know your own stories, that like nothing's new under the sun.
Right.
Like Jesus was addressing this. This is a thing that has been, I don't mean that as a despair, I mean that as hopeful. That like this has been part of life and part of the struggle of humanity and part of the struggle of religious people for a long time.
Yeah.
And so when we hear stories, we feel lots of feelings about, especially if it was someone who we looked up to and they had some sort of, failure to do with like an adultery, kind of a failure.
Yeah.
But it's like somehow things carry on. Sometimes life can just move forward afterwards.
Yeah.
Maybe that's the first thing that I think about.
No, that's great. Yeah.
Is like, this is like 2,000-year-old teaching that's just as relevant today.
100%.
And somehow it feels sometimes like the world's going to end when this stuff happens because it's such a big deal.
Of course.
And also like Jesus is still there and still like with us in the midst of it. That's the first thing I think of.
Yeah.
Yeah. I also just think about how, some people always think about, the Bible's so old and these teachings, like they're outdated and this and that. And this one specifically, when it's paired next to our current culture, right? We've all tragically heard and know the saying, sex sells, right? And we don't have to look far and wide. Our Instagram Explore page, if you're on Instagram, ads in a magazine, ads on TV or YouTube or wherever we consume media, you see images that are increasingly more and more provocative. It's just the way it goes, right? If you look at supermodels from 50 years ago, Marilyn Monroe, that era, to now, it is like people, men and women, are hyper-sexualized in our media, and we see it all the time. Yeah. And so I think about this passage, and it's not a condemnation of beauty or people or bodies or anything, which we can often take it to be, and it can be very damaging to all of us who understand and have shame or issues around our body and body image. But rather, it's this culture that needs to be, I think, looked at more critically and saying, what are we doing to ourselves by exposing ourselves to images that we really weren't meant to be exposed to en masse in the way we are? And this idea of like looking lustfully at another is problematic, and we're confronted with it all over the places. Mm-hmm. And so it's something that I think it's so relevant for our time now. How do we understand how to place this stuff and how to be wise? We're not going to stop consuming media. That's crazy, but how can we put checks and balances in for ourselves that we're not tipping into a place that is unhealthy?
Yeah. Jesus, this is another one of those statements. Jesus says, you have heard it said, or you know this commandment. So he's reframing it. And so, the commandment was do not commit adultery. And even this was, compared to the culture of the day, was a step forward.
Yeah.
Because men in those days were generally allowed to do whatever. So even this law that was an Old Testament law for the Jewish people was a step forward. Mm-hmm. It was kind of no one should commit adultery. It was almost together. And now Jesus is putting it even more forward.
Right.
Because we could say, well, I'm not committing adultery. He's like, oh, no. You're not off the hook that easy. Anyone who looks with lust is guilty of and then all of a sudden you can't just
well, it's not my problem then.
Yeah, it's not my thing. It's like, no, hold on. As he often does on lots of things,
right,
where we tend to say that's your problem.
Yeah.
Like, no,
it's essentially saying you've dehumanized.
Yes.
You've made this person a thing, an object for your desire, for your
consumption.
Yeah. And even possession, like I think it tips into that idea of like ownership, and that it is this sense of like you desire to have that thing, whatever it is, and as soon as we see people as things that we can have or hold on to, or we like it consumes us, like I want that person for whatever reason, it becomes an inappropriate relationship, and it doesn't even have to cross physical kind of intimacy boundaries, but that you would see someone as something that you can acquire. Yeah. And like lust after it, like I think there's more to that word than just like a sexual desire, but like a desire to have ownership over someone is wrong, like full stop. You're not valuing, you're not seeing them as a human.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And one of the other things I like here, I mean, obviously, certainly now more than ever, men and women, this is an issue for everybody. So it's not just about a man looking at a woman lustfully.
Right.
Like again, men are as hypersexualized now as women. Like
Absolutely.
this is an equal struggle. But what also Jesus is doing here in this other subversive way is uplifting the power position of a woman.
Yes.
That like she is of value. She is in the image of God. She is to be protected, cared for, respected, not just an object of your desire, an object of your like that. Like men can be that too in our culture, but in this context,
sure,
he's talking about women who had no voice actually getting some power.
Totally.
Yeah.
But it's interesting though that the turn in the passage here, where it is like it's better to like gouge out your eye and cut off your hand, and kind of these ways that we would act on our desires or our lust or whatever. And I don't think there are many people taking it literally.
Right.
I should hope, right? Because we don't have this history of people walking around with like no hands or one eye or whatever, right? But the reality is that it's an internalized desire. It's something that we may never show outwardly, but there are there can be outward consequences, and I think that Jesus kind of like makes this transition from inward. It's this thing that you feel like you have this desire, you have this lust, but he ratchets it up to be like it's better to like have yourself maimed in this way, which is kind of a gruesome and grotesque picture. Yeah. But like when we boil it down, you can lust without eyes and hands.
Yes.
So it's not like doing those things is going to stop you.
Right.
But again, like we've seen in other episodes here that we've been in discussion on, the onus is on the self-responsibility.
Yes.
It's not on the other person, which often in church culture, this purity culture stuff, especially, I know this experience as a younger woman, a teenage girl in the church, it's put on like the woman has to cover up, the woman, because you don't want to cause this man to stumble, kind of a thing. As opposed to, and there's some truth to that gets taken a little far. But there's this piece that's so significant. It's like, it's on you, guys.
Yes,
like,
that's the thing.
And girls. But like, this is like, you can't just say, well, she made me do it.
Yeah.
No, like you are the one who's responsible for your own thoughts, your own actions, your own deeds. So if that's a problem for you, get yourself out of the situation.
Yeah.
If your phone is a problem, maybe you need a dumb phone instead of a smartphone.
Yeah.
Whatever. Like, cut it off.
Yeah, exactly. And that's where I think you can see is like, what is it in me that's causing this? And remove that. Cut that off. And it doesn't have to be your physical
well, it's her
body.
fault or it's his fault that I felt this way. It's the media's fault.
Right.
Okay, then like, what does it look like to not have that media in your life?
Yeah.
I don't mean like all the media, but that particular, whatever it is.
Yeah.
But it seems like it's radical too.
Yeah.
Like it is better to make like a radical decision and be the guy or the girl with the dumb phone that you can only text, a few sentences at a time.
Yeah.
Than have this phone that like draws you into like lust and covetousness and unhappiness about your own life because you're just constantly immersing yourself in all this stuff that you can't attain.
Yeah, and I think that makes me think of Martin Luther, the famous reformer. He had this quote. He says, "I can't stop a bird from flying over my head, but I can stop it from making a nest in my hair." And I think that there's a lot of us that feel like, I have to like react so dramatically and cut all technology and get rid of everything. And it may be true for some of us, like we need to have those things.
Yeah.
But like having a lustful thought is not gonna you're not gonna be condemned, or it's not this awful thing. We're human, and we have desires, and we have emotions and things that we are drawn to, and that's like part of the human experience. But the question is like, what do we do with that? And how do we acknowledge it and not let it consume us, and maybe make those checks and balances when appropriate to say, okay, I don't think I need this in my life, so I'm gonna cut that part off. I'm not gonna have my phone in the bedroom or wherever it might be.
And well, like John Mark Comer, who's an author, pastor, speaker, he talks about giving your parent your phone, give it a bedtime.
Yes.
Like a few things you can think about as an analogy of how to parent your phone, but that like put it to bed before you go to bed.
Yeah.
Your kids go to bed before you put your phone to bed.
Yeah.
You're the boss, not it. Cut it off. There's got to be an end time for this.
Yeah. And like we talked about last episode around the idea of anger, I feel like this one around lust too, it's one that we can easily hide and pretend like there's nothing going. Like we can have whatever outward appearance we want, because it's that internal thing that's going on. And Jesus is like challenging us on even the things that are easy to hide. Those matter. Those are the things that can then lead to outward action and struggle.
Usually it's found out later anyways.
Yes.
All this stuff we think we're so good at hiding.
Yes.
First of all, people probably, even just in the room that we're in, like, you guys know some of with barely knowing me, you could probably see some of my problematic tendencies, within the first 20 minutes of knowing. Like, we think we're so good at hiding. We're not.
Yeah.
Right.
But then more than that big stuff like this, we all know those stories of how it all comes out. It does all come out eventually.
And I would say, as a dad of 2 daughters now, I only grew up with brothers. We were talking about off camera about our families. Like I see this so much in such a different way now through them and helping, through what they have to say and around the idea of responsibility. Is it my responsibility, or like creepy looks or things like that? And I was just never aware of that the same way. And I do feel like these conversations, there's a time and place for guys to talk to guys about some things and like get some things right, but there's also, it's so important to hear from each other.
Yes.
Because I just don't have a complete picture on what that is. And like every week we've been talking about this, my internal world is my responsibility.
Yes.
That's what I have to own, and I have to be willing to like stare that down. And it's been a huge, it's a challenge. Like this sexuality is a challenge.
For sure.
Not to put that on you, but for me, for sure, like over the different seasons of life. And I keep thinking the way I get control on this and wrestle this to the ground and submit it to Jesus is a marker of my discipleship, even though I don't have to tell you about it. And sometimes the things that get most praised are things that, they're doing all these things. I'm like, yeah, but if no one may know about this except Jesus, but this is equally as important, maybe more important to what it looks like to have a life surrendered in this ethic of Jesus.
So like maybe someone else besides Jesus should know.
Yeah.
Let's
what
start
does that
there.
look like in terms of talking and being honest with each other and safe conversations?
Yeah. Well, and I'm single, and so I often find this kind of conversation around acknowledgement that we are also sexual.
Yeah.
No one knows what to do with a single adult.
Right.
They only know how to teach it to someone who's like, I'd call under the age of 21. I'm in my 30s. And so what is the teaching, training conversation? How does that change for a person in their 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s who, human biology hasn't changed.
Right.
But we don't have like sort of what we would call like a covenantal outlet for sexuality.
Right.
We aren't married, and so there is no place for it. Is there?
Right.
That's a question.
Yes.
And so I think that usually it's taught by a guy who got married, usually pretty young, under the age of 30, under the age of 25 even.
Yeah.
And so they didn't actually have to live through a life of singleness,
100%.
of celibacy or whatever.
Yeah.
And so it doesn't mean you can't speak to it ever, but let's just acknowledge that there's like a lot of complexity to it. And we know that like 40% of adults are single.
Right.
So how do we wrestle through this conversation? When it's not about adultery, it's it's a different kind of lustfulness or struggle.
Yeah.
Anyways, just that.
No, that's so good that you bring that up.
We all need places to talk about this stuff.
Yeah.
Otherwise, it goes weirdly sideways.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Well, it just puts it into a box that is too small to contain it. And the people, often the voices that are in charge or speaking the loudest, don't have that experience. And I think that on the whole, we've done a poor job of making space for the experiences and the voices of young to old single people who have valid and important experiences that are often like silenced in the church because it doesn't look like the quote unquote norm of biblical leadership or whatever, biblical manhood and womanhood. And I think that
whatever that means.
Whatever that even means. And that like whole narrative, I think, needs to be examined and changed. And this is part of that conversation. And so, that's so good. Because like that's a conversation that Matt and I would not
But the
think
person
of.
saying it is single.
Yes,
Jesus
exactly.
is single.
In his 30s.
In his 30s. We have something in common.
Yeah. I love it.
Lead the way, Joe.
Yes.
Oh, I don't know.
You've heard it said.
Yeah, but I
say.
I love it.
Yeah. Final thoughts before we toss it back to the groups?
I think it's just it comes back to for me it comes back to the idea here that Jesus is inviting us to live into like this idea of righteousness. And it's not just like an external conformity, something that we can see from the outside. Oh, that person seems to have it all together. But for us, it is that, like you said, Matt, our inner life, and it is our inner being that we need to expose to Jesus and even others, like trusted friends, to say, hey, this is what I'm working on. This is where I struggle, and do that in community, and know that like we will go much farther together than what we can do on our own.
Joanna, anything?
Yeah, well, I started by saying this really matters, and I still feel like it really matters on this side of the conversation. Maybe just an acknowledgement that for some of us, adultery has affected us personally, whether that's in a relationship or by a parent or someone we love and trusted dearly who has let us down in this way. And then an invitation to the text just before around like harboring hatred and what it does to us, that we're accountable for ourselves.
Yeah, it's good.
Thank you.
Tough.
Yeah, that's really important.
Yeah.
Okay. Great chat. Thank you.
Big one.
Over to you. Bless you as you have the conversation. Praying for you, and here anytime, reach out if we can help, and we'll pick back up on these teachings of Jesus next episode. Peace.